Good Monday morning, Northstate. Preston Donion here with another update on the fire situation across Northern California, taking a look at a couple of those larger active fires in detail in terms of those hot spots, where we've seen that activity, what fire crews are doing, and then how that smoke is going to be driven, and of course how fire activity will play out because of those winds. So we're going to start you off with the green fire, right? This is now mapped over 11,000 acres. You can see in orange, those are hot spots mapped by satellite. So that satellite flies over several times a day, and it kind of maps out where we're seeing heat detected. And so you get a rough idea on where that fire activity is. So what we're seeing here is, if I kind of pull this down, you can see the full fire perimeter. What's changed since we talked about this on Friday? Well, you notice that we now see the fire perimeter all the way down to the shoreline of the Pitt River arm of Shasta Lake. So we have seen that fire creep down, and it really has been creeping. You've seen some video maybe on social media of that low intensity fire kind of making its way down the hillside, down to the edge of the water. And that's what happens when we get backing, right? Because we are going against the wind. The winds have been generally out of the south, at least during those daytime hours, and so that's going to drive that fire activity to the north, and that's where most of the dramatic increases in fire acreage have shown up. But you are seeing these kind of hot spots as that fire backs down against the wind, and so it's lower intensity and it's slower moving generally, but it has filled in all the way down to the water line. Now, in their daily update yesterday, Forest Service put out, said they have 24-hour suppression out on the water to keep the fire there on the north side of Shasta Lake, because we think about all those communities and everything that could happen if that fire were to jump the Pitt River arm and jump over closer to 299 and down to the south side of Shasta Lake. That would be a huge problem. But they are focused on keeping that right there on the shoreline and not letting it jump across. So that's a huge point of contention. Now, what I want to point out is, we zoom in a little bit here, you'll see these dots kind of splay out a little bit in a weird way, but notice this weird kind of ring. What I think you're seeing here, and in terms of some of these heat signatures that continue onto this ridge line, that may have to do with CAL FIRE and Forest Service, these fire crews, their working efforts to kind of create fire lines. So they've done their own fires, right? You see this sometimes. They start backfires, they start things like that. They were firing a line here along Rip Gut Ridge. So you see this creek, and I'll take my pointer tool, and you can see this area right here. This is Rip Gut Creek, and then this might be Rip Gut Ridge. That's as far as I can tell what Rip Gut Ridge would be. And there's been firing efforts here to kind of use that as a primary containment line and keep the fire within these bounds, right? We're well established here towards Brock Butte, but to contain it within this line and keep it in this kind of Rip Gut Creek drainage would be a huge success. And so that's why they've kind of gotten out ahead of that growth and decided to emphasize firing here. So that's what we're seeing. Now, let's take you over to the Summit fire. This is one that has no new hotspots in that most recent flyover. We did see a couple over the weekend, so that's worth keeping in mind, that it has been a little bit active, but containment is increasing on that. We're closer to 30% on the Summit fire, and this is a part of the larger Marble complex, if you're familiar with that. So not a lot to talk about here, but definitely positive. A lot of great containment on the north and east side of those fires. That's kind of the things they emphasize when they talk about how things are going in that situation. Now we're looking at the Butler fire. This is one that's over 7,000 acres here on Monday morning, and you can see those hot spots, newer ones in red, older in orange, but they're all within the past 24 hours. But where's that most recent activity? Well, it's where towards the southwest flank of the fire. So drifting a little closer to the Humboldt County line. And of course, we're in Siskiyou County that we're talking about here. You can see Orleans. I'll use my pointer tool. This is about where Orleans is. You've got Soames Bar up here, and of course you do have Forks of Salmon a little closer. And we have seen a lot of fire activity kind of pushing down this drainage, and that has been a concern, right? Some of these communities, the Butler Flat area, we talk about Nordheimer Campground, all of that in this vicinity of the fire has been an area of concern. They've done a lot to protect structures there, but you do see a lot of dots kind of all the way around, indicating that this fire is continuing to grow, and it has been displaying moderate to active fire behavior through the weekend. So that's the story in terms of the major fires across the North State. Now let's take a look at those perimeters and the distances to a couple of our communities. Starting with the green fire, where we began, right? You can see that fire perimeter, very interesting and complex, but this may have to do with that firing line along Rip Gut Ridge. Again, let's get back to those distances though. You're seeing this has shrunk a little bit, right? We've seen the fire creep a little bit further off to the east, and that'll continue. We're expecting to stay on that north side of Shasta Lake, but I would expect to see this fire perimeter to continue to grow to the north and to the east. And so those distances to Round Mountain, to Montgomery Creek, are likely going to shrink. But they're going to do everything they can to keep that fire on the north side of the lake. So even though those distances are going to shrink, they're going to do a lot to make sure that we don't get anywhere concerning, right? But those numbers are going to come down and your smoke impacts may continue to be pretty poor in those areas. So we're seeing, again, this was about 8 miles to Montgomery Creek on Friday. Now we're about 7.25, and we're down about a half a mile in terms of distance from the fire to Round Mountain from when we talked on Friday. We'll take you now to the Summit Fire. And again, I mentioned not a ton of activity and also really healthy distances to our communities. Now, the Pacific Crest Trail is out there, and so you maybe have some hiking incidents and things like that would come up, and you may have to replan travel through the Marble Mountain Wilderness. But otherwise, we're still seeing really healthy distances to our communities, and that's really, really important. Now, looking at the Butler Fire, this is one where we've seen some of those numbers change a little bit. You're still looking at about 5 miles to Soames Bar, right? Because that driving wind has kind of pushed a lot of that fire activity to the south, southeast at times, southwest a little bit as well, especially in those overnight hours, right? We get that kind of drainage wind offshore, and so that's pushed some of that activity a little closer to Orleans, and now you measure that at about 4 miles to Orleans. But again, this is on the other side of the county line, 2.6 miles to Soames Bar, and we see a lot of spots out there. Now, I want to point out what you're seeing with this element here. This is the Jacket Fire, right? You haven't heard about that in a while because they've done a great job of getting containment on that. But the Butler Fire is fairly active. This continues to see a lot of little spots kind of popping up here and there. And this was originally a spot fire when we talked about it on Friday, and that has now become its own pretty well-established portion of the larger Butler Fire. And you're likely going to see these areas, these holes in the map kind of fill in as fire activity continues. But I think you're going to want to watch for fire activity to continue to increase to the south-southeast as that north-northwest wind picks up. And that's where we're going next. Let's talk about how those winds flow throughout the day, right? You have drainage winds down into the valley, coming out of the northeast into places like Redding, Bella Vista, Palisadro, Anderson, seeing a ton of smoke because that wind is coming from right over top of the fire. But that changes during the day, right? We're going to start to get that south wind established. So in Tehama County, maybe you've got some slightly bad air out there. Things look a little too hazy. That's going to start to improve. In places like Redding, we'll finally feel a little bit of that into the later afternoon, and you're going to get that air really starting to reset and clean up a little bit. Now, looking towards the fires themselves, when we talk about the green fire, with that wind out of the south-southwest, fire activity is going to continue to the north-northeast. So we're going to watch that closely, and of course that containment line was put with that in mind. That's why they use Ripgut Creek as kind of that drawing line to contain the fire in terms of its northeast spread. So we're going to watch that as a line today and see how well that holds. But of course, fire crews working their tail ends off out there in these brutal, hot, smoky conditions. So that's the story with the green fire. Let's talk about the winds as it relates to the Butler Fire, right? We had a little bit of offshore flow this morning, so that took some smoke out closer to the coast. Now we're seeing that pick back up, and that onshore wind is going to bring really good clean air into Humboldt and Del Norte counties. You might be in Orleans, 4 miles away from a significant fire, but you're not going to smell it because that's going to be pushed off to the south and to the east because of those onshore winds off of the ocean. So a place like Weaverville, Trinity Center, Coffee Creek, those areas might be dealing with pretty bad air quality into the afternoon. Even with it already poor this morning, you don't get that chance to kind of flip the script. You're going to be dealing with that coming off the Butler Fire pretty well throughout the day. And fire activity is going to increase to the south and to the east on the Butler Fire with that driving wind. And of course, terrain is a big factor in these areas. They're very mountainous, and so it's not going to be the general large-scale winds that drive everything. You're going to get little valley breezes that happen out there. You're going to get uphill runs, things like that are more important than those winds at times. But in terms of air quality for most of our communities, these driving winds are going to be the major factor to consider. And let's take a look at that smoke, right? By noon today, we're seeing a lot of places see pretty improved air quality as that south wind gets driving out there. Yes, it's still hazy all throughout the valley, and yes, portions of interior Humboldt County are still smelling smoke, but as we push later on into the day, you see very good clean air across the far western reaches of the Northstate. Pretty good clean but hazy air throughout the valley, all the way up towards Lakehead, but near Shasta Lake, and then up towards Round Mountain, Bernie, even up towards Alturas. Tonight and into early tomorrow, some of that surface smoke will show up out there, and expect that haze to worsen in the valley and likely at least reach that unhealthy for sensitive groups category in places like Redding and Palisadro. And I'd expect some of that surface smoke to be even worse than it looks like here, especially just east of I-5. But we're going to get that good south breeze again tomorrow, and that'll help keep surface air quality better during those daylight hours, and thankfully into tomorrow, heat starts to subside as well. Stay safe out there. Make sure you are not out in that smoke as much as you can, and thinking of the firefighters, thank you to all the first responders that are out there making sure these fires get contained. Stay safe, stay cool, and I'll see you on Daybreak tomorrow.